Kentucky.
I'm a rash and a roving blade. I've got silver in my pockets, and I follow the roving trade. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy, whiskey, 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 Nancy, oh. I went down through Galway City, Nancy whiskey I chanced to smell. I went in, sat down beside her. 7 long years I've loved her well. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy whiskey, 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 Nancy, oh. The more I kissed her, the more I loved her. The more I kissed her, the more she smiled. Soon I forgot my mother's teachings. Nancy soon had me beguiled.
Kentucky is famous for its bluegrass fields and thoroughbred horses. At one time, most people would have mentioned Kentucky bourbon whiskey in the same breath. But times have changed. Americans still drink, but they drink only half as much bourbon today as they did 20 years ago. Still, all is not bleak in bourbon country. Warehouses full of aging bourbon still dot the countryside, and a growing export trade to Europe, Asia, and Australia has stimulated new optimism as the rest of the world discovers this uniquely American spirit.
What's bourbon? It's whiskey that has been aged in barrels, and a special kind of barrel.
It's made from mash.
It's alcohol made in Kentucky.
It's liquor, alcohol.
It's probably strong drinking whiskey.
What is bourbon? Well, the answer starts here, with Kentucky's abundance of springs and streams. Because the water flows over limestone, it's clean, high in calcium and low in iron. It tastes good, and it's ideal for making whiskey. The other primary ingredient in bourbon is grain, mostly corn, most of it grown in Kentucky or nearby Indiana. Other grains, including rye, wheat, and barley, are used with the corn. No mere container, the white oak barrel is an equal partner in the bourbon-making process. As the whiskey ages, it absorbs sugars and other components from the wood. The final ingredient is yeast. Distillers protect their particular yeast strains jealously and nurture them carefully because each strain imparts a slightly different flavor. At the distillery, the grains are measured out, ground, mixed with water, and cooked to convert the starch into sugar. This mixture is called the mash. After cooking, chilled water is used to cool the mash down to the ideal temperature for fermenting. The mash is fermented in huge vats. The older ones are cypress. The new ones are stainless steel. Yeast is added and fermentation begins. Yeast is a microorganism. It eats sugar and produces alcohol and carbon dioxide. The CO2 is why it bubbles. In 3 or 4 days, the fermentation is complete. The mixture is now called distiller's beer. Its alcohol content is about 11%. The beer is then pumped to the beer still. Distillation is based on the fact that alcohol vaporizes at a lower temperature than water. From the beer still, alcohol vapors are condensed back into a liquid and distilled again to remove impurities and raise the alcohol content to about 70%. The new whiskey is then reduced with water to between 50 and 60% alcohol and put into barrels. The full barrels are put into warehouses where they stay while the whiskey matures, 4 to 6 years in most cases. Right now, approximately 200 million gallons of bourbon are aging in Kentucky warehouses. Imagine a 61-acre lake, 10 feet deep, full of bourbon. When the whiskey is mature, the barrels are dumped. The whiskey is cold filtered and water is added to reduce its alcohol content to between 40 and 50%. Then it's bottled, labeled, packed, and shipped. That's a short look at how Kentucky bourbon is made today. But Kentucky's whiskey-making heritage is even older than the state itself.
Many of our settlers were from Pennsylvania, and they had been making whiskey in Pennsylvania from other grains, particularly rye, for some time. The independent individual came to Kentucky. This wasn't the shy fellow who was going to wait till everything was real safe. They came down on flatboats. They brought their wives, their children, and their pot stills. And they knew that Kentucky grew corn, because this was the word that came back. This is a great, great soil. Plant the corn, get back, and come back in 3 months, and you've got something to eat or something to sell. So they had not really been making whiskey from corn in Pennsylvania. I'm sure they knew how, but that wasn't a grain that they were using. But since that was the grain of choice here, and the one that grew so readily, then they had too much corn, and they couldn't do anything with it. No roads. We didn't have good roads here until the 1830s. So in order to utilize that crop, they had to put it in a form that would keep or would sell readily. And they knew that alcohol always sold readily, so they turned it into a whiskey. They loaded up the flatboats and they waited for the rain. And when it came, or when the thaw came, they would get on that boat and start down.
When Easterners first started settling here in 1774, Kentucky was part of Virginia. Probably the first whiskey was made within a year or two of the first settlement. In 1780, the Virginia legislature divided Kentucky into 3 counties. By 1786, there were 7, including Bourbon County, named for the French royal family in gratitude for its help during the Revolutionary War. The most important settlement in Bourbon County was Limestone, which later became Maysville. For many years, this was the region's main port on the Ohio River, from which whiskey and other goods were floated downriver to New Orleans for sale. Any whiskey shipped from the port of Limestone was liable to be considered a product of Bourbon County, regardless of where it was made. Even after Limestone became part of Mason County, and later when other counties were formed, many still called the region Old Bourbon. As the demand for Old Bourbon whiskey grew, other distillers here and in adjacent states began to use the name. Pioneer distillers were mainly farmers. They distilled their own grain, and maybe some for their neighbors. Making whiskey in a still like this one was as common as making sausage or baking bread.
This industry evolved slowly, and it's pretty hard to put your finger on when it started, or really when it started to look like an industry and much less like a division of agriculture. I guess really it was the early 1840s when wise Kentucky farmers who knew how to make whiskey decided that they needed to flip the process around, and instead of having farmers with excess grain drive the process, have customers looking for good red whiskey drive the process, and have the farmers, the agricultural dimension, respond to it. So it was my great-great-grandfather, which would make me the 5th in the line of commercial distillers, but in fact it was my great-great-grandfather's grandfather, Robert Samuels, who mustered out of the Pennsylvania militia in the spring of 1780 as a distiller for Washington's army, and came to Kentucky with a land grant, with a corn writ, which was the first form of homesteading in the country, and set up a small farm and provided distilling services for neighboring farmers who grew too much grain to feed it all to the cattle. So that was the beginning of the industry, I think, as a cottage industry, but it was really in the early 1840s that you started to see the commercial distilleries develop.
In the beginning, it was word of mouth and local. You did send it down the rivers, but you really didn't have a jug that said, made in Bardstown, Kentucky, sort of thing. You sent it by the barrels. It was limited in how much you were going to sell that way. Before the Civil War, you still were doing that. We had some distilling here, quite a bit of distilling, but it was still on a local market you sold it to the local tavern keeper. Maybe somebody coming through picked up a jug of it and took it somewhere else. You sent it to Louisville. They served Nelson County country ham at the Galt House. They probably also served Nelson County bourbon whiskey, you know. It wasn't advertised as that, but I think everyone, you know, realized that they'll always ask you, where is this bourbon from? When we travel today, we look on the label and that tells us what we're drinking and where it's from. And I think they did the same thing. They would ask. It wasn't really listed. After the Civil War, and when the railroads opened up the West, and the West is what I'm talking about because that was where all the action. The gold rush of '49, and then later after the Civil War, the settlement of the West, all the taverns, all of the railroad building and all, there went the commercial whiskey salesmen. And they had to carry their goods, they had to carry a sample of their goods, but they also had to, when they sold it, the people wanted what they were buying. They didn't want something sent to them later that wasn't what they were actually buying, or what they had tasted and were buying. And this is when our distilleries really got into here on producing it for the commercial market. And when the name Belle of Nelson and Old Tub of Beams and the different names that have Henry McKenna for one, all of these names were respected names at the time.
The main difficulty with whiskey in those days was consistency. I mean, the whiskey made at a given distillery would jump all over the lot one day to the next. It got better. It got a lot better after Dr. James Crowe introduced the saccharometer, which really started to give whiskey some consistency. And that was in the 1840s. And of course, the other dimension that was so important was the steam engine. It gave us a chance to get this stuff out of here because it's pretty heavy. A barrel of whiskey weighs 600 pounds. And so with the steam engine, we all of a sudden had access to upstream markets. We had, right behind it, we had the rail. And so we had a way to get grain and barrels in and whiskey out.
In the early days, whiskey was sold to bars and restaurants by the barrel. And normally a whiskey salesman would give to each purchaser a bottle that might have the name in enamel of whatever his distillery was. And sometimes in antique stores you see some of these pretty old hand-blown decanters. But the way whiskey was served was you would go to the barrel, open up the tap, fill up the bottle, close the tap, and put the stopper on the bottle. And if you were a bartender or a restaurateur, it would sit behind your bar. And if you wanted some whiskey to take home, you brought your own bottle and filled it up, bought a bottle's worth, and paid the man his money. But as a result of it all coming out of various barrels, sometimes some unscrupulous retailers would water down the product or put cheaper whiskey into something that probably should be a very fine product, and you couldn't tell because it was all hidden in that great big barrel. So doctors in that era who prescribed whiskey as medicine and as a tonic for good parts of the population found that they really couldn't rely on any particular brand of whiskey to give them a high-quality product they could prescribe to their patients year after year and time after time. And so my great-grandfather heard of one of these doctors bemoaning the fact that he really couldn't find any reliable, high-quality whiskey to prescribe with confidence. He started what later became Brown-Forman, and the first thing he did was to put the finest whiskey he could obtain into bottles and sealed them right at his own place of business, so that when a customer bought the whiskey that he called Old Forester, it had a seal right on and from his own bottling operation, which said that this whiskey is absolutely pure and the finest and highest quality, and you can enjoy it with great confidence, knowing that that nobody has fiddled with it.
In 1879, there were almost 200 licensed distilleries in Kentucky. Prohibition and World War II took their toll on the industry. By 1955, there were just 58 active plants, all in central Kentucky, except for 3 downriver in Owensboro. Today, 9 companies operate the 12 distilleries still making bourbon in Kentucky.
That's Jack Daniel's bourbon? E&J, Brandon? No.
Maker's Mark, Blandon, especially after their famous rivalry.
Very Old Barton, that's a bourbon, right? Let's see. Now, Wild Turkey is Sour Mash, right?
Heaven Hill, Early Times, Old Bardstown, or Very Old Bardstown, I guess.
The best-selling bourbon in the world is Jim Beam, named for the man who ran the company before Prohibition and brought it back after repeal.
There were maybe some 40, 50 plants just in this area right here. And when Prohibition came along, they only came back with about 20. I think it was 20 or so. So in other words, that 15 years of Prohibition, that killed a lot of the plants. That killed them, and they didn't come back. But my grandfather there, he was 55 years old, Jim Beam, when Prohibition came in, and then it was repealed in 1933, 34, and he was 70 then, see. So that was 15 years later, and he still had enough spunk at 70 years old, that's one of the things that I marvel at. At 70 years old, now see, I'm 62 and petered out almost. At 70 years old, he came in here and built the distillery, built his warehouses, set his stills up, and the whole thing, and got that thing running, and ran it for 10 years himself until he was 80 years old. He and his son, Jeremiah. And then he lived to be, after he retired from there at 80, 81, he died at 83 years old in this house here. And last thing I saw him the day before he died. We were over here Christmas 1947, and I'd been quail hunting. I was 18 years old when he died. And I gave him some quail I'd killed, and he'd been during Prohibition, he'd been in the coal mining business, and he had some shotguns, some Model 12 Winchesters that he had guarding the coal mine for some reason or other. And he asked his wife, Mary, asked if, see, I'd been hunting since I was knee-high to grasshopper, and he said, reckon Booker's old enough to have that gun? So she says, yes, Jim, I think he's old enough to have it. So I said, go get it. So she went down to the cupboard there and pulled this Winchester out, and he gave it to me that day and died. See, that was on December 25th, Christmas Day, and he died the 27th, and his sleep. So that was, I don't know whether he got to eat those quail or not, but I hope that's not what did him in.
Jim Beam operates 2 distilleries within a few miles of each other, one in Bullitt County, the other in Nelson County. The Beam family no longer owns the company, but family traditions run deep. Booker's uncle, Jeremiah Beam, ran the company with his partner, Harry Bloom, and cousin, Carl Beam. Carl's son, Baker, is distiller at Beam's Claremont Distillery. All of the Beams are descended from Jacob Beam, who sold his first barrel of Kentucky whiskey in 1795.
See, there were several Beams. There was old man Jack Beam, who owned the Early Times plant. Joe Beam had 7 sons, and yes, I knew every one of them. Right, I knew all of them. In fact, I worked with Elmo at Deatsville at the old TW plant, and of course I worked with him at Maker's Mark. And I worked with Harry at Heaven Hill. Harry was there when I went to Heaven Hill.
Is it his son that's there now? Or?
No, that's another one. Park Beam was a brother to old man Jim. And this is Park's grandson, who's at Heaven Hill now. Now, Park had 4 sons, I believe, 1 daughter. And 2 of those sons were in the whiskey business. Earl was a distiller at Heaven Hill up until he retired quite a few years ago. But Carl, or Shucks, was the distiller at Jim Beam at Claremont. Now, Carl's 2 sons are at Jim Beam now. And Earl's son is at Heaven Hill.
They have a great reputation for making, the Beam family in general have a very good reputation for making whiskey. Even those who do not have a last name of Beam but are descended from that family. And I've said before, it must be in the genes, because it seems like every time you turn around, oh yeah, that's a grandson of so-and-so who was a Beam. And I don't know whether it's instinct or what, or maybe just the inclination to produce a good batch.
Roy had 2 sons, Jack and Charles. And I believe Charles was first at the old Midway plant in Park and Tilford. And I don't know what happened to him, but Jack now was at Yellowstone. Now that's Roy's son. His grandfather was Joe Beam.
At Heaven Hill in nearby Bardstown, Booker's cousin Parker Beam is the current master distiller.
As we say, our master distiller emeritus, Mr. Earl Beam, was the brother of Mr. Carl Beam, who was the former master distiller at Jim Beam Distilling Company. They, of course, learned their trade from their father, and ultimately one of them stayed with the Jim Beam Company and one of them came to us. Well, Earl Beam's son, who is now our current master distiller, is Parker Beam, and his son, Craig Beam, as we call him, our master distiller in training. This is the kind of industry that has a great deal of history and heritage. You know, bourbon is the only indigenous distilled product of the United States. It's not from a borrowed culture. It's something that we have. It's part of the American culture that dates back to the very early days of the United States Republic. We got involved in the distilled spirits business almost by accident. The family had been involved in another business that was located in this area. My father was living in Bardstown. Shortly as, just as Prohibition was ending, a group of investors who had been involved in the distilled spirits industry prior to Prohibition came to my father and said, would you and your brothers like to become involved in a new venture in the distilled spirits industry? Well, this was really a lark, because the family knew absolutely nothing about the industry. The name Heaven Hill is actually a family name. It was the family's patriarch was a gentleman by the name of William Heaven Hill, who was a farmer who lived on this site in the late 1700s.
Heaven Hill markets their bourbon under many different brand names. Evan Williams is their best-selling brand. They also have some of the great names from bourbon history, like Henry McKenna. The other active distillery in Bardstown is Barton, makers of the brand Very Old Barton. The Barton plant is located on the site of several historic Bardstown distilleries, including Tom Moore and Mattingly and Moore. Bell of Nelson, a leading bourbon of the 1890s, originated here.
It's really almost a blessing to be able to work in a business that has so much lore and so many fine people in it. And I mean that sincerely, I really do. Both in our company and in other companies. For me personally, one of my prime, most critical functions is doing everything that I know how to do to maintain the continuity of that lore. I feel like I'm as protecting history as much as I am making whiskey. Our senior fermenter can look at fermenters and he'll say, well, I haven't seen that much corn oil in a while, wonder what's going on, or he'll make some other offhand comment, and then when the grand scientist dives in and starts making measurements, it's almost always something comes to light that really is different. But the whole process starts when skill and experience looks into the fermenter and says the bubbles aren't breaking right. Even in the older, more stable companies, people get old and they retire. And that's a great loss. It really is. I think American industry in general has come to the point of thinking that people are just like gears on the machine down on the production floor, and when one goes away for some reason or breaks, well, you just put another gear in just like it. It doesn't work. There is a almost mystical process underneath this whole technical thing that goes on, and the guys who have been around longest are the ones who are most attuned to that process. Those are the guys who really know what's going on.
Barton Distilling Company purchased Tom Moore in 1944. Its chairman was Oscar Getz. Almost immediately, Getz began collecting artifacts and memorabilia of the American whiskey industry. Now that collection resides here at the Oscar Getz Museum of Whiskey History in Bardstown, just a few hundred yards from the Barton plant.
And there are lots of surprises in this little museum that people come in and they think, oh, well, I'll go through this in a hurry. But they can't hurry through. There's too much to see. And if you really want to learn some things, there's just some marvelous treats in store here. And we've just got some things here that kind of rock you for a little bit, and they're fun, you know. Then when they discover about the presidents, that always interests them. James Monroe was the superintendent in Ohio of the distilling business. George Washington was a distiller of some renown and made rye whiskey at his plantation along with his brandies and had 5 stills. And Abraham Lincoln, young Abe, had a little liquor license for a year or so on the prairie in New Salem, Illinois. Those are all discoveries not many people do know. I think, you know, nobody expected things would go this well with this little place, but it just has exceeded all our dreams. And I love it. I love working here.
The railroad determined the location of many distilleries in the days before trucks and highways. Follow the Bardstown and Springfield branch from the main line of the L&N, and the first distillery you reach is Limestone Springs. The distillery is gone, but Jim Beam owns the site and uses the warehouses. Next is the Jim Beam plant at Claremont. Another 2 miles down the track are the ruins of the original Old Grandad Distillery, built in 1882 and operated until Prohibition. There's little here now, but a writer at the time described it as well appointed in every particular, with ample warehouses, high and dry and well ventilated, all within a few feet of the railroad track. Then you come to the old T.W. Samuels plant. The Samuels family built their first distillery on or near this site in 1844. The distillery closed years ago and the warehouses were sold to Heaven Hill and Maker's Mark. And that's where the Samuels family makes whiskey today, at Maker's Mark in Marion County. But the Deatsville plant and its owner, Bill Samuels' great-great-grandfather, are remembered for their unique role in the history of the American Civil War.
He was a large man. He was about 6'6", in those days was quite large. He had an older brother, Dr. Reuben Samuels, who married Jesse and Frank James's mother and raised them. Did a wonderful job. And as a result, ended up in somewhat of a caretaker role with Quantrill's army as they came to Kentucky to avoid the demise of the latter period of the war. They came directly to Nelson County, where my great-great-grandfather was high sheriff. So they got what they were looking for. A pardon was worked out on July 25th, and it ended up being the final surrender of an armed Confederate band of the American Civil War, and it happened right at a distillery, our old family distillery in Nelson County, Kentucky. It did not happen at Appomattox Courthouse, as General Lee thought, but it was back here some 90 days later. This place was founded as a distillery farm by the Burks family, who were from Scotland. They came over about 1800, a land grant from Virginia, and they started making whiskey in a sporadic way, as many of us did. This was a fairly typical distillery, 200 bushel size, which is what we operate today. So in a sense, you're able to see the distillery as it would have looked in the 1870s, 1880s, because the physical integrity of the place is intact, or we use it to operate at the same capacity it was designed to be operated 120 years ago. But the Burks family, they started and they stopped. They were first successful, and then the next generation wasn't so successful, and then there was a cholera epidemic, and then we had Prohibition, and that knocked us all a loop. Dad bought it in 1953 and started the move toward making his style of whiskey, and it's ideally suited for that great water, small size, isolated. And when it looked like the company was going to work as a company, started the restoration of the old 19th century plant, which has been a lot of fun and good therapy. I think making a great whiskey, making a distinctive whiskey, is not any different than doing anything else that's distinctive. Number one, you have to have the self-confidence to free all the tradition-bound burdens, and you need to want to do it real bad. And I think that's what really distinguished my father. Financially, he didn't need to do any of this stuff. It was an incredible burden, and it was an awesome risk, and it worked. And I really do believe that before my father went off to that great distillery in the sky, he wanted to be able to go with his head up, and that meant create a better whiskey than anybody in the family had ever done, significantly better. And I think he's done it.
About 30 miles east of Bardstown is one of the most unusual distillery buildings in Bourbon country. It was built in 1910 by the 5 sons of J.T.S. Brown. Today, it is the last bourbon distillery owned by Seagram's, which once owned at least 10.
With the advent of the demise of the small rural distilleries, as we referred to them, as they continued to shut down, and the distiller that was at this location was, he was in his middle to late 50s, and it looked like it was going to be a long time before he's going to be retirement age. And I'd sort of given up hope that there would ever be any movement back from a big distillery where I was in Lawrenceburg, Indiana, back to the small distillery. But Seagram's came by with an early retirement package for Charlie Beam, who was a distiller here, and he took it. And I happened to be in line with my training and age, and was available and made myself readily available to come back to Kentucky to be a distiller in a small distillery. It was a dream come true. I think it's just a fun area to work in, and working with a biological process. It's very similar to, I suppose, to making cheese or making wine, and developing unique and different flavors that I think it's and every distillery is different. No two distilleries make quite the same product, and you know that whatever you're doing at your distillery is different from anybody else's, and if it's good, it's real good, and of course if it's bad, it could be a problem, but if it's acceptable, no one can really duplicate it exactly.
The other distillery in Anderson County is Wild Turkey, perched on a scenic bluff high above the Kentucky River.
Distillery building for Wild Turkey is still one of the original buildings, and one of the storage houses is still the original building as it was built back in the late 1800s. We're still using the same. Some of our fermenters that we're still using are the original fermenters to make the Wild Turkey bourbon. The Wild Turkey brand was started by the McCarthy family many, many years ago, and it was over a wild turkey hunt. There's a group of businessmen that was in the spirits business. They went on a wild turkey hunt every year down in the Carolina area, and each year different ones of them had to take different things, food and wines and this, and bourbons. And time came for the McCarthys to take the bourbon. They just went and got some bourbon whiskey and took it with them, and they all talked about how good the bourbon tastes. So he didn't think much of it at that time, but the next year when they got ready to go back on the wild turkey hunt, they called him and asked him, it was his time to bring something else. They called him and asked him to bring back some of that same bourbon that he had brought the year before. And he really didn't even know what he had for his taking, but with all the government regulations, you have to keep records and all, and he went back and found it was 8 years old and 101 proof, which is an odd proof back in that day and time. Most of your bourbons was 100 proof, bottled at 100 proof. He took it back again for the hunt. They talked about how good, how smooth it was. So being a businessman, he said, I better start marketing it and call it the Wild Turkey. You know, we have to have a good product with a name like Wild Turkey to make it go. But that's the story of how the name of Wild Turkey started, from the Wild Turkey hunts. But really here with Wild Turkey, we haven't changed a whole lot. It's being made the old-fashioned way. It's an old-fashioned bourbon whiskey. We're still called a heavy-body bourbon. A lot of the bourbons has went to a lighter product, what we call a lighter product. But for as Wild Turkey, we haven't changed. It's still the old-fashioned, heavy-bodied bourbon whiskey. Has a lot of flavor, good flavor to it and all, and that's what we're looking for here with the Wild Turkey product. Even the bottles, our liters and 750s, it's still the same type of bottle that bourbon was first bottled in. We're still putting a cork finish in our bottle the same way that bourbon was originally bottled. And we get all of our barrels from Independent State Company. It has to be white oak, has to be charred to be bourbon whiskey, and we use the heavy char. Where again, I get back, Wild Turkey still old-fashioned bourbon. We're still using the heavy charred barrels like bourbon was made many years ago. You have 4 thickness of char, number 1, number 2, number 3, and number 4. And what that means is that the char, the barrels are just burnt more. And we use the number 4. That's the heaviest char that you can get. And we again think that makes a better taste in bourbon, more flavor, more color. This is where it all comes from. The color and all in bourbon whiskey comes from the aging in the barrel.
Follow the Kentucky River north about 10 miles and you reach Frankfort, the state capital. Once this was a major distilling center. Now only one remains. Ancient Age. Built in 1869 by Colonel E.H. Taylor, it has had many owners and many different names, but is most associated with Colonel Albert Blanton.
Anyone who grew up in this area knew Colonel Blanton because he was well known, highly respected in the community. You knew him through church membership, you knew him through civic activities, this sort of thing. So I knew Colonel quite well before I came to work here. And then I became much impressed with his knowledge of the business and his expertise as a master distiller. He was a perfect gentleman at all times, dressed almost formally. He was a quiet, easygoing type fellow. He was not a real high-powered personality, and he was just the hometown folks to all of us.
Colonel Blanton has been immortalized with a bourbon that bears his name. Blanton's is one of the new luxury bourbons. Each bottle comes from a single barrel, and each barrel is selected by Elmer Lee. Louisville, about 50 miles west of Frankfort, is Kentucky's largest city. Between the Ohio River and the railroad, Louisville has always been the region's key commercial hub. Naturally, scores of bourbon makers have been based here. Back in 1874, Brown-Forman was the first company to sell whiskey in bottles. And here they own the world's largest whiskey bottle. Unfortunately, it's full of water. Today, Brown-Forman, a company built on bourbon, is a diversified international corporation with net sales in 1991 of almost $1.4 billion. But this is still a family company run by the descendants of George Garvin Brown. The CEO and president are brothers, and there are many other family members throughout the company.
Well, I don't think there was ever a time that I can remember where I wasn't aware of the whiskey business as an important part of our family. I remember coming down here as a little boy and remember the really kind of warm atmosphere and the friendliness of all the people who work at Brown-Forman. And I think that's still very true today. It's still a very friendly place to work. People have great respect for one another and enjoy working together. When I'd come, probably the most fun was to go into the bottling house, because that was very different from anything you'd seen at home. And here were these wonderful machines and the noisy rattle of the bottles hitting one another, and the bottling house ladies watching so carefully to be sure the labels were on just right and everything was just perfect before they'd let anything go into the cases and be sealed. And there were wonderful smells, which were very different from anything you would find most other places, of the freshly dumped whiskey flowing into the bottles. It gave off a wonderful aroma. And nearby here there were and still are tobacco warehouses where the smells of aging tobacco also would intermingle with the whiskey smells, and it was a very different and kind of wonderful, magical place to come to as a young person. It was a bustling place, and there were many more active distilleries up and down this several mile part of Dixie Highway on Louisville. It's a wonderful thing. I think you've got a great sense of belonging that comes from working at a family company that I think goes beyond just members of the Brown family. I think a lot of people sense that kind of team that's built probably by that family heritage and connection, which makes it a very wonderful cooperative place to work, and it gives I think a continuity of high standards that we all strive to, and makes that a very normal part of our everyday activities, so that you don't feel quite so transient that you're just in here for a little bit and then move on to something else. You have the feeling that what you're doing is something that will last on for many years to come. Like we're drawing on the heritage of many other people's work before us.
Next to Brown-Forman's headquarters is one of the 2 Louisville distilleries owned by United Distillers. This is the first new bourbon distillery built in decades. Only the beer stills and some of the fermenters have been retained from the old Bernheim distillery. The other United Distillers plant in Louisville is Old Fitzgerald. They also have a distillery in Owensboro. Because United has several distilleries and uses different formulas, this is a good place to consider some of the differences in bourbon styles.
You've got different families here, so yeah. Yeah, these are one family. This is
These are 2
family,
separate
and this is a
ones.
family.
Well,
So you've got 1, 2. You've got 3 different families of whiskey here. All of the whiskeys traditionally made at this plant are rather robust, full-bodied, heavy bourbons. There's a mellowness there because they are. We use the wheat rather than the rye as a small grain. That's not to say that you can't make a mellow whiskey with rye, of course. But I personally like the wheat characteristic.
This has a very nice smell. It is definitely different than its closest counterpart, the Tavern. The Charter, being a lot older, in my opinion, would have a different smell. But they're definitely different. You can smell the difference in the wheat and the rye. And it's hard to describe, but there's a definite difference there. The Charter in smell, in my opinion, is the age does show.
Is a characteristic which I would regard as coming from the barrel itself, the wood and the charred surface. That to me certainly represents the common base to these bourbons. And I mean, it's quite distinctive. It identifies it in a manner which distinguishes itself, let's say, from Scotch whisky.
That even with the most sophisticated analysis, you can't get it all.
And there's no such thing as taking bourbon and then just stretching it out and analyzing every component of it. It doesn't work that way. And as Ed's saying, the congeners that contribute some of these characteristics are in parts per trillion, and most equipment analyzes to parts per billion. And no one really has seriously tried to analyze every single component and then say this is what bourbon is. The simplest approach is the one that's been used forever, and that is, does it taste good? Does it look good? If it satisfies that criteria, then you've got a bourbon.
Louisville is also the home of one of the two remaining cooperages in Kentucky, Bluegrass Cooperage, owned by Brown-Forman. Since bourbon must always be aged in new barrels, the distilleries need a constant supply. Bluegrass makes 2,500 barrels a day. Though the manufacturing process has been modernized, the product is still an old-fashioned barrel. Just white oak with steel hoops. No glue, no nails. What makes this a whiskey barrel is the char, created by burning the inside of the barrel over gas jets.
That white raw whiskey that you taste that comes out of the still is, when put into the barrel, begins to extract right at the interface between the char and the uncharred wood. There's some partially caramelized sugars, natural sugars in the wood, and the whiskey in the aging process breathes in and out through that interface and actually extracts some of the natural color from the sugars. And the process of passing through the charcoal and through that wood also extracts some materials that impart some of that sweet, really, the old timers call it the honey barrel. The really good bourbon whiskeys are characterized by smooth, mellow flavor, and part of it does come from the barrel, obviously.
Old-time coopers made their barrels entirely by hand. Henry Hartman established his cooperage shop in Louisville in 1875. A replica of the Hartman cooperage can be seen at the Jim Beam Distillery in Claremont.
This is the way the whole process started, was with this tool here called a froe. They had their wood that they would split out, and they used this big club thing, wood, because you didn't want to damage your tool. And you could always replace this. There's a couple of them laying around here. Some of them are in pretty sad shape now, being 100-something years old. But this is how you split the wood out. From there, you would bring the wood, and we're arbitrarily going to say this piece of wood is a stave we're going to work on. Now, this operates as a foot vise, is what it does. This head comes down, clamps down on this, got some metal on it, and the cooper would start with his hollowing out process on the stave in this manner like this. When he got himself with a little curve in which he knew how to do and how much to do, then he would come back, and I'm liable to lose the head off of here because we're not using this stuff. Then he would come back and he would start shaping with a shaping knife. And a cooper could use this thing and come out with just as slick as a whistle to make these sides with this. And we've got the taper. He would cut the taper on it in this fashion, come up to the middle, and then he comes up to the top. And this is how the belly of the barrel is formed when each one of them is like this. These hoops and things are all lined up on the bung stave. They had a rhythm. I can't do it that good. I'd get a little, but they would go to kaboom, 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 you know, and then when the whole shop was going, I can remember this when I was little, you know, with them guys all hitting on those things, you know. It really makes music. Recreated. All of this is all from their place. That old workbench over there, that vise I had for many years in my garage, and when he set this all up, I pulled it out. I had to go buy myself a $100 vise to replace this, but I wanted everything that was theirs to be down here. And I get down here and I have a hard time leaving. I just love it.
Many of Bourbon Country's most historic distilleries are now closed, some in ruins. A several-mile stretch of Glens Creek between Frankfort and Versailles is particularly significant. Edmund Haynes Taylor was the bridge between the old and the new in bourbon history. Originally a banker, he was a deal maker who founded or purchased many distilleries in the Frankfort area. Taylor was acquainted with Dr. James Crowe. With partners, he purchased the old Oscar Pepper Distillery, where Crowe had worked until his death in 1856. Scottish-born and educated, Crowe was the first to apply scientific principles to bourbon making. His most famous innovation was introducing the residue of one distillation into the mash for the next distillation, creating a consistent environment from batch to batch. This process, known as sour mash, revolutionized bourbon making. For a brief time after Crowe's death, this was known as the Old Crowe Distillery. Later, Taylor and his partners built this plant, nearer to Frankfort, where Old Crowe bourbon was made until the 1980s. Next door, he built his showplace, the only distillery to bear his name, Old Taylor. To many, bourbon's future is here, in Great Britain and other international markets.
There's two parts of this industry. You've got the United States portion of the industry, and you've got what is now becoming an extremely important international portion of the industry. Now, the interesting thing is, while some people think that those are two distinct markets, in some respects it's the same strategy in both markets. And both strategies can succeed in both markets if we're all diligent and we all offer the right products to the consumer. It's important that the world know what a unique product bourbon whiskey is. It has all of the elements that consumers are looking for in this day and age. It has history, it has heritage, it has nostalgia, it has the true meaning of Americana. It goes right back to the very earliest days, to the very roots of the Republic of the United States. The international trade has become very dynamic. Bourbon has suddenly become the end distilled spirit around the world. It's certainly small at this point, but the point is that it's growing. Everybody says, well, whenever I talk about the international business, they always say, how's your business in Japan? Business in Japan is great, but it's more than that. It's considerably more than that. Bourbon is a growing and important item in Australia, in New Zealand, in France, in Greece, in Italy. We ship to Brazil, Argentina, Thailand. So it's not just a one-country export trade. And more importantly, it's growing in all of these markets. And it may be smaller in one market than another, but if we sold 20% more this year in a small market like Thailand, yes, it's still very small, but a few years of 15 and 20% increases, and you've got a real market on your hands. So the prospects in the export trade are really dynamic, and they're really exciting. I mean, all you have to do is to talk to the people in the cooperage industry here in the United States. All you have to do is talk to the people who are involved in producing labels for the export trade, and you're going to see a real hum of activity at those particular industries. And there's no better way to get the pulse and the feel of what's going on here than to listen to what some of our suppliers are saying. And there's been a real pickup in what's going on in this industry. More bourbon being produced by the producers today than there has been over the last 5 to 8 years. So prospects look pretty good for this industry, only because it can be very stylish, it's a very mixable commodity, very mixable product, and it has the right attributes that the American consumer is looking for.
Kentucky's bourbon heritage is a living tradition, passed through families whose roots here go back more than 200 years. The next chapters of this story are being written now in Kentucky distilleries and in worldwide markets. Kentucky's amazing red liquor carries on.
I'm a weaver, a Calton weaver. I'm a rash and a roving blade. I've got silver in my pockets, and I follow the roving trade. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy, whiskey. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy, oh. I went down through Galway City, Nancy whiskey I chanced to smell. I went in, sat down beside her. 7 long years I loved her well. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy whiskey. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy, oh. The more I kissed her, the more I loved her. The more I kissed her, the more she smiled. Soon I forgot my mother's teachings. Nancy soon had me beguiled. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy, whiskey. Whiskey, whiskey, Nancy, oh.
For more information about this program or to order a DVD copy, visit www.bourbonstraight.com.
What's it like to defend the freedom of the press in an era of alternate facts and accusations of fake news? Is American journalism in danger of being delegitimized? Find out as David E. McCraw, Deputy General Counsel at the New York Times, discusses his memoir, Truth in Our Times, with MSNBC legal analyst Chuck Rosenberg. Coming up on Great Conversations, David E. McCraw and Chuck Rosenberg.
Monday, 9, 8 Central on KET.
The 15 towers of KET statewide network broadcast more than quality television. KET transmitters form a vital link in the Commonwealth's emergency communications system. The National Weather Service, fire, police, and emergency medical services rely on KET's network to help keep us all safe. We at KET appreciate the responsibility And we offer our heartfelt thanks to Kentucky's dedicated first responders.
KET is the largest nonprofit GED education publisher in the country. KET, where learning comes to life.
This is the Kentucky